Picture yourself reclining on a couch that costs more than most people's houses. The year is somewhere around 80 AD, and you've just received an invitation to dinner at a Roman senator's villa. It's worth noting that this isn't the kind of dinner where you worry about which fork to use for the salad course. This is the kind of dinner where you worry about whether you'll survive the evening with your dignity intact, your stomach functional, and your toga unstained by whatever culinary madness awaits. You see, Roman banquets weren't meals so much as they were endurance contests disguised as social gatherings. The wealthy Romans of the imperial period had turned eating into an art form, a competitive sport, and occasionally a form of mild torture, all rolled into one delightfully absurd evening. They approached dining with the same methodical intensity they brought to conquering nations, except instead of siege engines, they deployed peacock tongues and fermented fish sauce, a system whose elegance was debatable. But before we begin, take a slow breath, and if this kind of calm, curious history helps you unwind, consider liking the video and subscribing. Also, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's oddly comforting knowing others out there are drifting off with the same strange stories. Now dim the lights, maybe settle under something warm, and let's gently sink into another soft detour through the past, where overfed Roman elites built entire rooms just to throw up and called it culture. The invitation in your hand specifies that dinner begins at the 9th hour, which sounds reasonable until you realize that Roman dinner parties didn't so much end as they gradually dissolved into a haze of wine vapors and regret. Also, you're expected to arrive prepared not just for a meal, but for what amounts to a marathon of consumption that would make modern competitive eaters weep with admiration. At least tonight, you won't need to pace yourself for a 7-hour dining experience. Now, you might have heard the persistent myth about Roman vomitoriums being special rooms where diners would excuse themselves to purge their stomachs, making room for the next course. It's worth noting that the reality is both more mundane and somehow more fascinating. The word vomitorium actually referred to the exits in amphitheaters and stadiums, the passages that would vomit forth crowds of people after gladiatorial games and chariot races. But the confusion is understandable, as was the custom of the time, because Roman banquets did indeed feature enough excess to make anyone question the structural integrity of their digestive system. What Romans actually had were specialized dining rooms, designed around the philosophy that if you're going to overindulge, you might as well do it in style. The triclinium, their formal dining room, featured 3 couches arranged in a U-shape around a central table. Also, you didn't sit at Roman dinner parties. You reclined, propped up on your left elbow like a marble statue contemplating the meaning of existence, except instead of pondering philosophy, you were pondering whether the next course would be roasted dormice or pickled ostrich brains. The seating arrangement wasn't random, of course. Romans had turned the simple act of choosing where to recline into a complex social algorithm. The most honored guest got the spot with the best view and the easiest access to the wine. By comparison, lesser guests found themselves relegated to positions where they could admire the backs of more important heads while stretching awkwardly to reach the appetizers. It was rather like assigned seating at a wedding, if wedding planners were ancient Roman status obsessives with a flair for passive-aggressive hospitality. At least your own dining table doesn't require a PhD in social hierarchy to navigate. Your host, resplendent in a toga that probably cost more than a small farm, signals the beginning of the feast with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggests he's practiced this moment in a mirror. The first course arrives. Gustatio, a selection of appetizers designed to awaken your palate and prepare it for the culinary assault to come. It's worth noting these include honey-soaked eggs, olives stuffed with various mysteries, and small fish pickled in solutions that smell like they could strip paint from walls. Hardly the sort of thing you'd find in today's hospitality manuals, but this is merely the overture. The true performance begins with the prima mensa, the main course, which isn't so much a course as it is a parade of increasingly elaborate dishes. These seem designed to test both your digestive capacity and your ability to maintain polite conversation, while confronting roasted peacock served with its feathers artfully reattached. The Romans believed that food should not only taste impressive, but look impressive, preferably while also being a touch unseemly to modern sensibilities. Between courses, slaves appear with perfumed water and towels, because eating while reclining is a surprisingly messy endeavor. You discover that consuming honey-glazed boar while lying on your side requires skills they don't teach in finishing school. Also, gravity becomes your enemy, and your toga becomes an unwitting napkin despite your best efforts at maintaining dignified dining posture. The Romans never quite solved the fundamental physics problem of eating sideways, which may have raised a few amphorae. At least tonight, your dinner won't involve wrestling with gravity while trying to look sophisticated. The wine flows continuously, mixed with water in ratios that seem to shift based on your host's assessment of how much philosophical discourse the evening requires. Romans considered drinking undiluted wine to be barbaric, the sort of thing that only Germanic tribes and other uncivilized peoples would do. This from a civilization that considered fermented fish entrails to be a perfectly reasonable condiment for every dish. The irony was apparently lost on them, much like their sense of proportion when it came to meal planning. As the evening progresses and the courses multiply, you begin to understand why Roman banquets had a reputation for excess that bordered on the mythological. The secunda mensa arrives, desserts and fruits that have been transformed through various alchemical processes into sweet confections fit for Bacchus himself. These bear only passing resemblance to anything that once grew on a tree. It's worth noting that honey features prominently, because Romans had discovered that sufficient quantities of honey could make almost anything palatable, including some things that probably shouldn't be eaten in the first place. Your fellow diners recline around you in various states of contentment and digestive contemplation. Conversation flows from politics to philosophy to gossip, because Romans believed that a proper dinner party should exercise both the stomach and the mind, though not necessarily in that order. Someone launches into a lengthy discourse on the proper way to train racing horses, while another guest explains his theory about why Germanic wine tastes like vinegar mixed with regret. A tradition better left in the past, perhaps. The servants continue their choreographed dance around the dining couches, removing empty dishes and replacing them with new culinary challenges. Also, you notice that your host has thoughtfully provided not just finger bowls, but also strategically placed vessels for those moments when even the most seasoned banquet attendee might need to acknowledge the limits of human digestive architecture. Romans were nothing if not practical about the realities of enthusiastic consumption, a rather inconvenient affair, but one they handled with characteristic efficiency. Luckily, your next dinner party won't require strategically placed backup vessels positioned strategically around your dining room. By the time the evening reaches its natural conclusion, which is to say when most guests have achieved a state of satisfied stupor that makes coherent conversation challenging, you've experienced not just a meal, but a window into the Roman soul. It's worth noting that here was a civilization that approached pleasure with the same systematic thoroughness they brought to engineering aqueducts. Except instead of moving water uphill, they were moving unprecedented quantities of food through the digestive systems of the empire's elite. At least tonight, your dinner plans don't involve marble floors and emergency exits. As you settle deeper into your dining couch, wine-warmed and contemplating the evening's gastronomic mysteries, you begin to notice the small army of slaves moving through the triclinium with the precision of a military operation. Each servant has a specific role in this elaborate theatre of consumption, and their choreography has been perfected through countless evenings of Roman excess. There's the slave whose sole responsibility is monitoring the oil lamps, ensuring that the flickering light never dims enough to cast unflattering shadows on the peacock's reconstructed plumage. Another specializes exclusively in the proper dilution of wine, measuring water ratios with the solemnity of a priest conducting sacred rituals. It's worth noting that getting the wine mixture wrong could result in either barbaric intoxication or civilized sobriety, both of which were apparently social catastrophes of equal magnitude. At least your dinner parties don't require a dedicated beverage mathematician. The slave assigned to napkin duty approaches with what appears to be a small towel, though you quickly discover that Roman napkins were less about cleanliness and more about strategic damage control. The fabric is designed to absorb the inevitable spills, drops, and miscellaneous food debris that result from attempting to eat while horizontal. Romans had somehow convinced themselves that reclining while consuming liquids was the height of sophistication, despite all evidence suggesting that gravity had not been consulted in this decision. The napkin slave's job requires the reflexes of a gladiator and the patience of a philosopher as he darts between couches, catching drips and dabbing at togas with practiced efficiency. Your host signals for the next course with a subtle gesture that sets the entire servant ecosystem into motion. What arrives defies both logic and appetite. A whole roasted pig, artfully prepared so that when carved, live birds emerge from its cavity in a flutter of wings and confused squawking. This is the kind of dinner theatre that makes you question whether Romans understood the difference between entertainment and psychological warfare. The birds, understandably disoriented by their unusual accommodations, proceed to fly around the dining room, occasionally landing in wine cups or perching on guests' heads with the casual irreverence that only animals possess. The other diners react to this avian chaos with the practiced nonchalance of people who have attended too many of these events. Someone makes a witty observation about the pig's surprising productivity, while another guest attempts to catch a wayward dove with his napkin. It's rather like dinner theatre if dinner theatre involved genuine livestock and the constant threat of bird droppings in your garum. At least your meals don't come with surprise wildlife releases. The conversation around you has taken a philosophical turn, as Roman dinner conversations inevitably did. Your fellow diners are debating the proper technique for eating dormice, those plump little rodents that Romans considered the height of culinary sophistication. Apparently, the correct method involves holding the creature by its tiny legs while nibbling delicately around the bones, though someone suggests that the truly refined approach is to consume the entire animal in one bite, bones and all. This leads to a heated discussion about the digestive merits of various small mammals, conducted with the same intellectual rigor that other civilizations might apply to mathematics or astronomy. You find yourself grateful that your culture's most controversial food debate involves whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Roman culinary discourse required a strong stomach and a stronger constitution for absurdity. As the evening progresses, you become aware of subtle sounds that suggest not everyone is successfully managing the evening's gastronomic challenges. There's the discreet cough that isn't quite a cough, the gentle excuse me that precedes a strategic withdrawal from the dining area, and the soft shuffle of servants armed with cleaning supplies. Romans may have perfected the art of excess, but they never quite solved the fundamental problem of what happens when human digestive systems encounter unprecedented quantities of exotic foods mixed with generous amounts of wine. The solution was characteristically practical: strategic placement of vessels and a staff trained in rapid response to biological emergencies. Yet somewhere in the corner, a slave quietly plucks the strings of a small lyre, the gentle melody weaving through the dinner conversation like a thread of sanity in the evening's elaborate madness. Even Romans, it seems, understood that chaos required its counterpoint of quiet music. Your host maintains his composure with admirable dignity, continuing to discourse on the proper aging of fish sauce, while servants discreetly manage the evening's inevitable casualties. It's worth noting that Roman hospitality included not just feeding your guests, but also providing comprehensive support services for when that feeding went slightly awry. At least your dinner guests don't require emergency digestive assistance. The next course arrives with considerably less fanfare than the exploding pig, a selection of what your host proudly announces as exotic delicacies from the furthest reaches of the empire. This turns out to include pickled jellyfish from the Red Sea, fermented mare's milk from the northern frontiers, and something that might once have been a shellfish but now resembles a small, glistening rock. Each dish comes with detailed explanations of its journey to your table, stories of brave merchants and perilous sea voyages, as if the food's travel itinerary somehow compensates for its questionable appearance. Romans believed that the more remote and difficult to obtain an ingredient was, the more it demonstrated their host's wealth, connections, and commitment to culinary adventure. The fermented mare's milk, you discover, has a taste that can only be described as aggressively rustic, coating your tongue with the essence of distant steppes and questionable preservation methods. The pickled jellyfish offers the delightful texture of pre-chewed parchment soaked in seawater, a sensation that makes you question the wisdom of empire building if this is what it produces. Someone at the far end of the dining arrangement is making brave attempts at the mystery shellfish, producing facial expressions that suggest profound philosophical contemplation mixed with mild panic. You begin to understand why Roman banquets were considered tests of character as much as celebrations of abundance. The ability to consume weird substances while maintaining polite conversation was apparently a crucial social skill in imperial society. At least your most challenging dining experience doesn't involve identifying your food through archaeological investigation. The wine continues to flow, and you notice that the evening's conversation has become increasingly animated. One guest is explaining his theory about why Egyptian wine tastes like liquid sunshine, while another is demonstrating the proper technique for eating olives without appearing to chew. This involves a complex process of strategic tongue positioning and careful jaw movement that looks rather like a cow contemplating complex mathematics. Romans had apparently devoted considerable intellectual energy to the aesthetics of consumption, developing elaborate techniques for eating various foods in ways that appeared effortless and dignified. Meanwhile, the reality of trying to eat anything while reclining on your side becomes increasingly apparent as the evening progresses. Gravity remains undefeated in its war against horizontal dining, and your toga has become an inadvertent collection point for various food particles and wine drops. The servants continue their patient ministry of cleaning and dabbing, moving through the dining room like gentle custodians of dignity, ensuring that the evening's enthusiasm doesn't leave permanent evidence on Roman clothing. It's rather like having a personal cleaning crew following you around during dinner, which sounds either luxurious or deeply embarrassing depending on your perspective. At least your dining experiences don't require a dedicated cleanup crew armed with towels and emergency supplies. As you recline there, wine warmed and contemplating the evening's surreal progression, you realize that Roman banquets weren't really about the food at all. They were elaborate demonstrations of power, wealth, and the peculiar Roman ability to turn any human activity into a complex social ritual with rules, hierarchies, and opportunities for both triumph and humiliation. The fact that they managed to do this while lying on their sides, consuming exotic animals, and maintaining philosophical discourse speaks to a kind of cultural determination that borders on the heroic, or possibly the deranged, depending on your perspective on the evening's events. Your fellow diners continue their reclining revelry, secure in the knowledge that they are participating in the height of imperial sophistication, even if that sophistication occasionally requires strategic retreats and emergency towel service. You let your eyes drift closed for a moment, the warm fog of wine and absurdity mingling into something like peace, while the distant lyre strings continue their gentle commentary on the evening's beautiful madness. As the evening deepens and your fellow diners settle into their wine-soaked philosophical discussions, you begin to notice something peculiar about the dining room's architecture. Near what you initially assumed was a decorative archway, guests occasionally excuse themselves with practiced casualness, disappearing through an opening that seems designed for efficient crowd movement. This, you realize with growing clarity, is the famous vomitorium, though not quite what centuries of misunderstanding have led you to expect. The word itself comes from the Latin vomere, meaning to spew forth. But Romans weren't thinking about dinner when they coined the term. They were thinking about people. A vomitorium was simply an exit, a passage designed to let large crowds spew forth from amphitheaters and public buildings without creating the kind of human traffic jam that turns civilized entertainment into accidental stampedes. The architectural feature had about as much to do with actual vomiting as a railroad tunnel has to do with trains getting sick. Yet somehow, over the centuries, the term became attached to the popular image of Romans gorging themselves, retreating to special rooms to empty their stomachs, then returning to gorge again. It's a myth so perfectly suited to our assumptions about Roman excess that it survived despite being completely wrong. like a historical game of telephone played across 2 millennia. You'll be relieved to know your culture's architectural misunderstandings don't involve assumptions about institutionalized purging. The reality of Roman dining and its occasional digestive consequences was both more mundane and more strategically managed than the vomitorium myth suggests. Beneath your dining couch, you discover there's a discreet ceramic vessel, not for decoration, but for practical necessity. Roman party planning included the thoughtful placement of chamber pots throughout the dining area, positioned with the kind of strategic foresight that modern event planners might apply to coat checks or emergency exits. These vessels were designed to handle whatever biological emergencies might arise from the evening's enthusiastic consumption, without requiring guests to leave the social spotlight. The arrangement required a delicate balance of accessibility and discretion. Too obvious, and the vessels would remind everyone of their own mortality and digestive limitations. Too hidden, and their discovery might come at precisely the wrong moment, creating the kind of social catastrophe that could end political careers or marriage negotiations. Your host has clearly mastered this balance, creating an environment where natural human functions can be accommodated without acknowledging their existence. It's rather like pretending that gravity doesn't affect reclining diners while simultaneously providing cushions to catch anything that falls. Romans had developed what might be called a philosophy of strategic ignorance when it came to bodily functions during formal dining. Everyone understood that extended horizontal eating combined with generous wine consumption might produce various biological responses. But discussing this understanding would violate the elaborate fiction that aristocratic Romans had transcended basic human limitations. Instead, they created systems of quiet management. Slaves moved through the dining area with practiced invisibility, emptying chamber pots, replacing napkins, and handling whatever discreet cleanup tasks the evening required. The goal was to maintain the illusion that cultured people existed in a realm above such mundane concerns, while simultaneously providing comprehensive support for when that illusion required practical assistance. This required servants trained not just in cleaning techniques, but in the subtle art of remaining unnoticed while performing highly noticeable services. They had to possess the reflexes of athletes, the discretion of diplomats, and the timing of theatrical performers, all while carrying buckets and towels. And now, the chamber pot, Roman engineering at its most humble. So far, your dinner parties don't require staff trained in invisible emergency response. The question of personal hygiene during these extended reclining marathons had been solved with characteristic Roman engineering. A small army of slaves whose job was to keep guests smelling acceptable, despite hours of horizontal sweating, in a room heated by oil lamps and packed with wine-breathing humans. These specialized servants moved through the triclinium, carrying small vessels of perfumed oils, dabbing strategic drops on guests' wrists, necks, and foreheads with the precision of military medics treating casualties. The oils were imported from across the empire: rose petals from Damascus, lavender from Gaul, exotic spices from India, creating personal aromatic environments around each diner. The technique required considerable skill, since too little oil left guests smelling like humans, while too much created the olfactory equivalent of a flower shop explosion. The servants had to gauge each person's natural scent production, account for wine consumption, which affected perspiration, and adjust for the room's general aromatic situation, which included burning lamp oil, cooking smoke, and the accumulated breath of a dozen reclining philosophers. Meanwhile, some particularly wealthy hosts employed what might be called human air fresheners, young slaves whose only job was to stand nearby looking attractive while emanating clouds of expensive perfume. These living aromatherapy devices were positioned throughout the dining room like decorative plants, except they occasionally moved and definitely cost more to maintain. You watch one of these scented slaves adjust his position near a particularly wine-enthusiastic guest, and you realize that Roman hospitality had reached levels of elaborate consideration that modern hosts couldn't imagine attempting without professional event planning certification. At least nobody at your dinner party has suggested employing dedicated human fragrance dispensers. The evening's wine consumption has reached the point where certain biological realities become increasingly difficult to ignore, despite everyone's commitment to aristocratic dignity. You notice that conversations have begun incorporating subtle pauses, not for dramatic effect, but to accommodate the kind of natural sounds that happen when human digestive systems encounter large quantities of fermented grape juice. Roman etiquette regarding flatulence was surprisingly complex and varied considerably depending on who was making the noise. Emperor Claudius reportedly considered legalizing public flatulence for dinner guests specifically, reasoning that attempting to suppress natural functions was both unhealthy and unrealistic. The proposal never became law, but it reflected a practical Roman approach to the inevitable consequences of horizontal dining and generous wine service. Different emperors had different policies on audible digestion. Some ignored it with imperial dignity, others treated it as a sign of plebeian weakness, and a few apparently used it as an opportunity to demonstrate their common touch by acknowledging shared human frailty. Your fellow diners have developed their own system of polite non-recognition. When someone produces an unmistakably biological sound, the surrounding conversation simply becomes slightly more animated, as if increased intellectual discourse could somehow retroactively muffle whatever everyone just heard. It's rather like a social conspiracy of selective deafness, where everyone agrees to develop temporary hearing loss whenever someone's digestive system joins the conversation. The result is a dining room where natural human functions occur within a bubble of determined ignorance, maintained through collective effort and strategic conversational timing. You find yourself admiring the sophisticated social engineering required to create an environment where people can be human while pretending to be above human limitations. You'll be pleased to discover your social gatherings don't require coordinated auditory denial systems. The complexity of Roman attitudes toward bodily functions during formal dining becomes even more apparent when you observe how certain guests handle the evening's more dramatic digestive consequences. Near the far end of the dining arrangement, you notice someone making what appears to be a strategic withdrawal, moving with the kind of purposeful casualness that suggests urgent biological necessity. For some Roman elites, the act of purging during extended banquets had evolved beyond mere physical necessity into something approaching performance art. These individuals treated the strategic emptying of their stomachs not as a failure of self-control, but as a demonstration of their ability to consume beyond normal human limitations and then reset their systems for further consumption. The technique required considerable skill and timing. Too obvious, and it appeared gluttonous. Too secretive, and it suggested shame about one's capacity for excess. The ideal approach was to make periodic, dignified withdrawals that implied sophisticated internal management rather than desperate biological emergency. Some guests had perfected the art of making these retreats appear philosophical, pausing to contemplate a piece of art, stepping outside to admire the garden, or engaging a servant in what appeared to be important household discussion. The goal was to create the impression that their absence was motivated by intellectual or aesthetic considerations, rather than urgent digestive necessities. Meanwhile, slaves specially trained in rapid cleanup and restoration waited discreetly nearby, ready to restore whatever private spaces might require attention. These servants possessed what might be called a medical understanding of party management, knowing exactly how to quickly restore areas to pristine condition without creating evidence of their activities. You realize that Roman banquets operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously: the visible level of cultured discourse and refined consumption, and the invisible level of comprehensive biological support services. At least your social events don't require specialized purging logistics and cleanup crews. As the evening progresses, you become increasingly aware of the elaborate systems Romans had developed to maintain the fiction that aristocratic bodies didn't produce the same biological evidence as everyone else's. The slaves responsible for what might be called personal dignity maintenance moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, armed with an arsenal of cleaning supplies, fresh linens, and various aromatic interventions. These servants had been trained to recognize the early warning signs of digestive distress, Subtle changes in posture, particular facial expressions, or strategic shifting, the kind that signals a quiet, internal negotiation between willpower and biology. Their job was to provide preemptive support, positioning cleaning supplies and offering discreet assistance before problems became visible to other guests. The Romans had essentially created a comprehensive biological support system disguised as hospitality. Chamber pots appeared and disappeared like magic. Soiled napkins vanished without anyone noticing their removal, and any evidence of human digestive limitations was managed with the efficiency of a military operation commanded by people who understood that social status depended on maintaining impossible standards of physical transcendence. Yet this same culture that went to extraordinary lengths to hide normal bodily functions also produced literature celebrating the earthy realities of human existence. Roman poets wrote about love, wine, and digestion with equal enthusiasm, creating art that acknowledged what their social rituals worked so hard to conceal. The contradiction suggests a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated and absurd, capable of creating beautiful poetry about human frailty while staging elaborate dinner theatre designed to pretend that frailty didn't exist. At least your culture's contradictions don't require armies of invisible servants armed with emergency cleaning supplies. Your eyes drift to the ceiling. Mosaics shimmer in the oil light. The wine has reached that perfect point where philosophical conversation becomes both profound and completely ridiculous, and you find yourself contemplating the strange beauty of Roman social engineering. Around you, guests continue their reclining discussions while an invisible infrastructure manages all the practical consequences of human existence, creating a bubble of artificial transcendence maintained through collective effort and considerable expense. Your host raises his cup in what appears to be a toast to the evening's successful navigation of both culinary adventure and biological reality. The gesture encompasses not just the visible guests, but the small army of servants whose skilled labor has made the evening's elaborate fiction possible. As you settle deeper into your couch, wine-warmed and surrounded by the gentle chaos of Roman hospitality, you realize that you're participating in one of history's most ambitious attempts to turn basic human activities into high art. The soft sounds of conversation, lyre strings, and discreet cleaning operations blend into something like a lullaby, the soundtrack of a civilization that understood both the grandeur and absurdity of human ambition. As the evening settles into its rhythm of wine-soaked conversation and discreet biological management, you begin to notice something rather more subtle than chamber pots and perfumed slaves. The arrangement of dining couches around you tells a story as complex and carefully orchestrated as any theatrical performance, written in the language of pillow placement and proximity to the host. Your own position, you realize with growing awareness, has been selected with the kind of strategic precision that Roman generals applied to battlefield formations. Every guest's location communicates their exact social standing, political usefulness, and current favor rating with mathematical clarity that would impress modern data analysts. The host reclines at the position of honor, the lectus medius, surrounded by the evening's most politically valuable attendees, like precious objects arranged in a museum display. As your gaze moves outward from this epicenter of influence, you can practically see the invisible lines of social hierarchy radiating through the room like ripples in a very expensive pond. Near the host, senators and wealthy merchants occupy cushions that seem slightly more plump, positioned at angles that facilitate easy conversation with the evening's most important figure. Their wine cups are refilled with remarkable frequency, their napkins replaced before showing the slightest stain, and their every conversational gambit receives the kind of attentive response that suggests active career advancement. You, meanwhile, find yourself positioned at what might charitably be called the promising middle distance, close enough to hear the important conversations, but far enough away to make joining them require raising your voice slightly above the ideal pitch for casual interjection. It's a location that communicates valued guest with potential for advancement, which is both flattering and mildly insulting in the way that only Roman social engineering could achieve. Further toward the room's periphery, you notice guests whose seating assignments tell rather different stories. Near what you now recognize as the servants' entrance, a local merchant who apparently misjudged his political connections finds himself reclining on cushions that seem slightly less cushioned, attended by slaves who move with fractionally less urgency than their colleagues serving the inner circle. The man's attempts to join the central conversation require him to project his voice across several layers of social stratification, creating the kind of awkward vocal dynamics that turn casual commentary into something resembling public speaking. Each of his contributions reaches the host's circle with the slight delay and increased volume that marks them as coming from the social margins, regardless of their actual merit. You rather suspect your own dinner parties don't require GPS coordinates to navigate the social landscape. The guest list for this evening, you begin to understand, represents weeks of strategic planning that would challenge modern diplomatic core. Your host hasn't simply invited people he enjoys, he's assembled a carefully balanced collection of political relationships, social obligations, and strategic opportunities, arranged like pieces on a very expensive chessboard. The senator to your left controls a crucial vote on upcoming grain legislation. The wealthy widow positioned near the host controls shipping contracts that could make or break commercial ventures. The young poet, tucked rather awkwardly near the wine storage, clearly owes his invitation to his family's connections rather than his literary merit, though he seems determined to justify his presence through enthusiastic recitation. At the same time, you notice several conspicuous absences, spaces where certain individuals might have been expected to recline, creating gaps in the social fabric that speak as loudly as any presence. The former consul who supported the wrong candidate in last year's elections exists tonight only as an empty cushion, his non-invitation serving as a public statement about the consequences of political miscalculation. These absent guests, you realize, are probably spending the evening at their own dinner parties, surrounded by their own carefully curated collections of allies and dependents, creating parallel universes of social hierarchy that occasionally intersect through shared guests who move between competing spheres of influence like diplomatic ambassadors armed with dinner invitations. The complexity of managing these overlapping social obligations requires the kind of strategic thinking that Romans typically applied to conquering other civilizations, except the battlefield is made of reclining furniture and the weapons are seating arrangements. At least your social calendar doesn't require battlefield logistics. As the evening progresses, you become increasingly aware of the subtle choreography governing every aspect of service and attention. The slaves moving through the dining area aren't simply providing hospitality, they're executing a carefully programmed sequence of social communications, each gesture designed to reinforce the evening's hierarchy through accumulated micro-interactions. Wine service, you notice, follows an elaborate protocol that has nothing to do with thirst and everything to do with public acknowledgement of status. The host's cup never empties, maintained at optimal levels through constant attention that borders on surveillance. The inner circle receives wine with theatrical flourishes, servers who pause dramatically, present bottles for inspection, and pour with the kind of ceremonial precision normally reserved for religious rituals. Your own wine service strikes a careful balance between respect and restraint. The slave attending your area pours with professional competence, but without theatrical embellishment, communicating valued guest who doesn't require constant reassurance of their importance. It's rather like being served by someone who knows exactly how much attention you deserve, which is simultaneously flattering and mildly insulting. Further toward the room's edges, guests positioned in the social periphery experience wine service that becomes increasingly functional and decreasingly performative. The merchant near the servant's entrance receives perfectly adequate wine poured with perfectly adequate technique, but without the dramatic pauses and visual flourishes that transform simple beverage service into public acknowledgement of social significance. Food distribution follows similar patterns of coded communication. The choicest portions of each dish migrate toward the host and his immediate circle through what appears to be natural selection, but is actually careful choreography. The peacock's most decorative elements find their way to the most decoratively important guests, while the functional protein gets distributed to those whose presence serves functional rather than ornamental purposes. You receive portions that strike the same careful balance as your wine service. High-quality ingredients prepared with obvious skill, but without the sculptural presentation that transforms dinner into art installation. It's food that acknowledges your social standing without making grand statements about your cosmic significance. Rather like being told you matter, but not that much. The evening's conversation patterns reveal another layer of social hierarchy operating through the seemingly casual flow of discussion topics and speaking opportunities. Near the host, dialogue moves with the fluid dynamics of collaborative performance, each participant building on others' contributions in ways that demonstrate both intellectual sophistication and social synchronization. These central conversations tend to focus on topics that allow for displays of cultural refinement, philosophical questions that have no definitive answers, literary references that demonstrate educational background, and political observations that reveal insider knowledge without committing to positions that might prove embarrassing later. Your own contributions to these discussions require careful calibration. Join too enthusiastically, and you risk appearing presumptuous. Remain too quiet, and you suggest either intellectual inadequacy or social discomfort. The ideal approach seems to involve making occasional observations that demonstrate you're following the conversation without attempting to dominate it, rather like intellectual background music that enhances the overall performance without competing for center stage. Meanwhile, guests positioned further from the social epicenter find themselves increasingly relegated to the role of audience members at their own dinner party. Their attempts to contribute to the central discussion must compete with distance, ambient noise, and the subtle but unmistakable social physics that cause conversations to flow toward, rather than away from positions of influence. The result is a dining room where speaking opportunities distribute themselves according to social gravity, creating conversational solar systems with the host as the sun and various levels of guest planets orbiting at carefully calculated distances. You find yourself grateful that your own social gatherings don't require astrophysics degrees to navigate the discussion dynamics. Perhaps most remarkably, you observe how the evening's entertainment schedule reinforces these same hierarchical patterns through what appears to be casual spontaneity, but is actually careful orchestration. The young poet's recitation, which initially seemed like voluntary enthusiasm, clearly represents a command performance designed to provide the inner circle with an opportunity to demonstrate their cultural sophistication through appreciative commentary. The poet himself occupies an interesting position in the evening's social ecosystem. Technically a guest, but functionally a performer whose presence serves the entertainment needs of more important attendees. His recitation provides the host and his allies with material for the kind of literary discussion that demonstrates educational refinement, while simultaneously highlighting the poet's dependence on their patronage. Meanwhile, the musician providing background accompaniment throughout the evening represents an even more subtle form of social stratification. Skilled enough to enhance the sophisticated atmosphere, but invisible enough to avoid competing with the guests for attention, he creates an artistic environment that makes everyone else appear more cultured by association. You notice that conversations pause respectfully during the poet's performance, but continue at low levels during the musical interludes, suggesting a hierarchy of entertainment that parallels the hierarchy of seating. Poetry requires active attention that demonstrates cultural engagement, while music serves as sophisticated background that enhances conversation without demanding intellectual response. The result is an evening where even the entertainment serves multiple social functions simultaneously, providing cultural enrichment, status display opportunities, and subtle reminders of who depends on whom for their artistic careers. At least your dinner parties don't require guests to perform for their supper, literally or figuratively. As you settle deeper into your carefully calibrated cushions, wine-warmed and increasingly aware of the elaborate social machinery humming around you, you begin to appreciate the sheer sophistication of Roman party engineering. Every element of the evening, from pillow firmness to wine temperature, has been orchestrated to create and maintain a complex ecosystem of social relationships, political obligations, and cultural demonstrations. Your host raises his cup in what appears to be a casual toast, but you now recognize as another carefully timed social gesture designed to provide one final opportunity for the evening's hierarchies to express themselves through the order of response, the enthusiasm of participation, and the wit of contributions to whatever collective sentiment he chooses to propose. Around you, guests respond with varying degrees of theatrical appreciation, their reactions carefully calibrated to match their seating positions and social aspirations. The inner circle produces the kind of spontaneous applause that suggests both genuine enjoyment and political wisdom, while the periphery responds with the slightly delayed enthusiasm of people following social cues rather than genuine impulses. As the evening begins its transition toward whatever entertainments your host has planned for the later hours, you realize that you've been witnessing one of history's most elaborate attempts to transform dinner into theater, with every guest serving simultaneously as performer, audience, and critic in a production that somehow manages to be both magnificent and slightly ridiculous. The soft sounds of cultured conversation, gentle music, and discreet social positioning blend into something approaching a lullaby, the soundtrack of a civilization that had elevated the simple act of eating together into an art form requiring professional-level social engineering and the services of what amounts to a small army of invisible stage managers. As the evening's theatrical dinner performance continues its gentle descent into wine-warmed contentment, you notice something rather extraordinary about the building that surrounds you. The villa itself seems to breathe with the same calculated precision as the social choreography unfolding within its walls. Every architectural detail designed to manage not just space, but experience itself. Your host's home represents something far more ambitious than mere shelter. It's a carefully engineered environment for controlling human perception, comfort, and behavior with the kind of systematic thoroughness that Romans typically applied to conquering entire continents. The hypocaust system humming beneath your feet maintains the floors at precisely the temperature that encourages lingering conversation without inducing drowsiness, while strategically placed windows create cross breezes that carry the scent of jasmine and rosemary at intervals, calculated to enhance rather than overwhelm the olfactory experience. Even the acoustics have been orchestrated with mathematical precision. The dining room's proportions create what modern sound engineers would recognize as optimal reverberation times. Conversations carry clearly to their intended audiences while maintaining the kind of intimate ambience that makes conspiratorial whispers feel both natural and slightly thrilling. It's rather like dining inside a very expensive musical instrument designed specifically for the performance of sophisticated social intercourse. The lighting, too, follows patterns that seem almost supernaturally attuned to human psychology. Oil lamps positioned at carefully calculated heights create pools of warm illumination that flatter complexions, while casting the kind of romantic shadows that make even routine political discussion feel mysteriously significant. The flames dance with precisely the right amount of movement to suggest liveliness without creating distraction, as if each lamp had been individually trained in the art of atmospheric enhancement. You suspect your own home lighting consists mainly of on and off, with the occasional candle for when the power goes out. It's within this context of obsessive environmental engineering that you first encounter one of the evening's more curious architectural features, what your host casually refers to as the vomitorium, gesturing toward an elegant archway that leads to what appears to be a rather posh retiring room. The term itself carries a certain dramatic weight that suggests exactly the sort of purpose you might expect from a civilization renowned for its spectacular excesses. Except, as your host explains with the slightly superior tone of someone correcting a persistent historical misconception, the reality proves rather more mundane than the popular imagination suggests. The word vomitorium, in proper Roman usage, refers not to chambers designed for digestive relief, but to the passages in amphitheaters and stadiums through which crowds spew forth, architectural throats as it were, designed to manage the flow of thousands of spectators with the same hydraulic efficiency that Romans applied to their famous aqueducts. The confusion, he notes with evident amusement, seems to have emerged from later historians who combined the Latin root vomere, meaning to spew forth, with popular assumptions about Roman dining habits, creating a linguistic accident that has persisted with remarkable tenacity through centuries of increasingly creative historical interpretation. Still, the misconception isn't entirely baseless, as the retiring room he indicates does indeed serve functions related to digestive management, though perhaps not quite in the theatrical manner that modern imaginations fancy. The space beyond the archway reveals itself to be a sort of biological intermission lounge, equipped with facilities for the discreet management of various bodily necessities that arise during extended social performances. You rather admire the Roman approach to acknowledging that even the most sophisticated cultural events must occasionally accommodate the inconvenient realities of human physiology. The room itself embodies the same principles of engineered comfort that govern the rest of the villa. Marble surfaces maintained at skin temperature through hypercaustic extensions, subtle ventilation systems that ensure air circulation without creating drafts, and decorative elements chosen specifically for their ability to provide visual distraction during moments when you might prefer to avoid contemplating your immediate circumstances. It's the sort of room where marble and embarrassment never quite meet, all very posh in the way your cat fancies, their litter tray is private real estate. Even the fixtures demonstrate Roman engineering at its most thoughtfully applied. Bronze fittings designed for both durability and aesthetic appeal, water systems that provide adequate pressure without excessive noise, and ergonomic considerations that suggest careful study of human comfort requirements. It's rather like discovering that your hosts have employed teams of engineers to optimize the most basic aspects of biological existence. What strikes you most, however, is the complete absence of shame or embarrassment surrounding these facilities. Roman attitudes toward bodily functions seem refreshingly practical compared to the elaborate euphemisms and psychological complexities that later civilizations would develop around the same basic human needs. The retiring room exists as a simple acknowledgement that sophisticated social performance sometimes requires brief intermissions for biological maintenance. Your modern loo habits probably don't involve marble surfaces or dedicated ventilation engineers. The actual practice of intentional digestive relief during extended banquets, your host continues, does indeed occur, though perhaps not with the systematic regularity that popular history suggests. The Roman approach to managing extended feasting involves what might be called strategic emptying, periodic breaks designed to maintain optimal appreciation for the evening's culinary offerings without requiring heroic feats of intestinal endurance. These practices, however, follow social protocols as elaborate as any other aspect of Roman dining etiquette. The timing of such intermissions must be carefully coordinated to avoid disrupting important conversations or missing crucial political negotiations. The discretion required involves not just personal modesty, but social awareness of when one's temporary absence might be interpreted as disinterest, political statement, or simple bad manners. Seneca, writing with his characteristic blend of philosophical observation and practical advice, noted that the wise guest learns to anticipate his body's requirements and manage them in ways that enhance rather than detract from his social effectiveness. The art lies not in avoiding the necessity, but in timing it so perfectly that other guests assume you've stepped away for mysterious and probably important reasons. Pliny the Younger, meanwhile, documented the elaborate preparations that some hosts provided for guests who required digestive intermissions, including specialized chambers equipped with what amount to ancient versions of antacids, digestive aids, and breath fresheners. The goal was to ensure that biological necessity didn't interfere with social performance, rather like having a backstage area where actors could adjust their costumes between scenes. The most sophisticated practitioners, apparently, developed the ability to return from these intermissions, appearing refreshed and mysterious, as if they'd spent their time contemplating profound philosophical questions rather than addressing basic physiological requirements. It's a skill set that combines practical body management with theatrical self-presentation in ways that would give modern dinner party guests a proper bit of bother. At least your social gatherings don't require strategic planning for digestive intermissions, though perhaps they should. The broader Roman approach to managing bodily functions you begin to understand, reflects their characteristic talent for transforming basic human needs into opportunities for social engineering and technological innovation. Their public toilet facilities, for instance, represent marvels of hydraulic engineering that would impress modern sanitation experts, complete with running water systems, heated seats, and social spaces designed to transform necessary biological activities into opportunities for networking and political discussion. Roman bathhouses take this concept even further, creating elaborate social ecosystems around the simple need for personal cleanliness. These facilities function as community centers, business districts, libraries, and social clubs, all organized around the basic human requirement for periodic washing. The progression through rooms of different temperatures follows patterns designed to optimize both physical comfort and social interaction opportunities. The caldarium's intense heat encourages the kind of philosophical conversation that emerges when physical discomfort strips away social pretense. The tepidarium's moderate temperature provides ideal conditions for business negotiations that require clear thinking without excessive formality. The frigidarium's shocking cold creates shared experiences that bond visitors through mutual suffering and recovery. It's rather like discovering that your ancestors had transformed every basic biological function into an excuse for elaborate social architecture and community building. The Roman genius seems to lie in their refusal to treat human physiology as something to be hidden or ashamed of, instead incorporating it into their broader project of creating environments that optimize both individual comfort and collective social functioning. Your own relationship with public facilities probably doesn't involve philosophical discussions or spot of business networking between the washing and the drying. As the evening around you continues its gentle progression through increasingly sophisticated stages of social performance, you find yourself appreciating the remarkable thoroughness with which Romans approached the challenge of creating optimal conditions for human gathering. Every aspect of the experience, from the temperature of the floor beneath your feet to the discreet availability of digestive relief, has been engineered to support the evening's larger purposes. The retiring room that initially seemed to represent simple excess now reveals itself as part of a comprehensive system for managing the complex logistics of extended social performance. Like the carefully calibrated lighting and acoustics, like the strategic seating arrangements and choreographed service patterns, it serves the Roman commitment to transforming basic human activities into opportunities for cultural refinement and social advancement. Your host raises his wine cup in another carefully timed toast, this one acknowledging the villa's amenities with the kind of casual pride that suggests both sophistication and practicality. Around you, guests respond with the appreciation of people who understand that true luxury lies not in excess for its own sake, but in the thoughtful anticipation of human needs and the engineering skill required to meet them elegantly. The soft sounds of satisfied conversation, gentle music, and discrete architectural functionality blend into something approaching perfect environmental harmony. The soundtrack of a civilization that had somehow managed to transform even the most basic aspects of human existence into components of a larger artistic and social vision. As wine and warmth and the villa's engineered comfort begin to work their intended magic, you realize that you're experiencing something rather more sophisticated than a simple dinner party. You're witnessing the Roman approach to life itself, the systematic application of engineering, psychology, and social science to the fundamental challenge of making human beings comfortable enough with each other to create the sort of civilization that builds aqueducts, conquers continents, and designs vomitoriums that aren't actually what modern people think they are. The evening settles around you like a carefully designed blanket, warm and supportive and precisely calibrated to encourage the sort of drowsy contentment that makes both good conversation and peaceful sleep equally achievable possibilities. It's the sort of comfort you'd imagine if a philosopher and an interior designer had teamed up to create the perfect evening after 3 goblets of wine and a proper understanding of human nature. The evening settles around you like a carefully designed blanket, warm and supportive, and precisely calibrated to encourage the sort of drowsy contentment that makes both good conversation and peaceful sleep equally achievable possibilities. It's the sort of comfort you'd imagine if a philosopher and an interior designer had teamed up to create the perfect evening. After 3 goblets of wine and a proper understanding of human nature. Yet even as you marvel at this extraordinary feat of environmental engineering, you can't help but notice the wonderfully human details that no amount of Roman planning could entirely control. The guest to your left has been nursing the same cup of wine for an hour, clearly more interested in the conversation than the drinking. Someone near the far couch has developed a case of the giggles that threatens to undermine an otherwise dignified discussion about grain imports. The host's carefully orchestrated seating arrangement has already begun to dissolve as people drift toward more interesting conversations, creating new social geometries that would probably horrify the evening's original architectural intentions. Even the most sophisticated Roman social engineering, it seems, must eventually yield to the fundamental unpredictability of human beings simply being themselves. You find this rather comforting, actually. The musicians in the corner have shifted into something softer now, melodies that seem designed less for entertainment than for creating a gentle acoustic backdrop to the evening's natural conclusion. The oil lamps burn lower, their flames settling into the kind of steady, hypnotic rhythm that makes everything feel slightly dreamlike and temporally fluid. Conversations have taken on that particular quality of late evening discourse, still intelligent, but with the hard edges softened by wine and warmth, and the comfortable exhaustion that comes from spending hours performing sophisticated social interaction. Topics drift between the profound and the delightfully trivial, with the easy fluidity of people who no longer feel the need to impress each other quite so desperately. Someone is discussing the proper cultivation of oysters. Someone else is expounding on the metaphysical implications of architectural proportion. A small group near the window has become entirely absorbed in debating whether purple or crimson makes for more effective political messaging, as if the fate of the empire might hang on their conclusions. It's all wonderfully, absurdly human, this gathering of people who have engineered heating systems and aqueducts and retiring rooms with marble surfaces, yet still can't quite engineer away the basic strangeness of existing as conscious beings who must eat and drink and make conversation while pretending that any of it makes perfect sense. Your modern dinner parties probably don't involve quite this level of architectural ambition, though perhaps they achieve something similar. That peculiar alchemy that transforms a group of essentially bewildered humans into something approaching genuine community, at least for an evening. The villa around you hums with the quiet satisfaction of systems functioning exactly as intended. The hypocaust maintains its perfect temperature. The ventilation carries away cooking odors and replaces them with garden scents at precisely calculated intervals. The acoustic proportions continue to flatter every conversation, making even mundane observations sound mysteriously significant. Yet for all its sophisticated engineering, the evening's real magic seems to emerge from the spaces between the planning, those moments when Roman precision gives way to simple human warmth, when carefully orchestrated social performance relaxes into something more like genuine affection between people who happen to share the same strange historical moment. The guest beside you has begun to nod off slightly, lulled by wine and conversation, and the villa's engineered comfort into the sort of peaceful drowsiness that makes the evening feel like it could continue indefinitely. Others show similar signs of contented fatigue, that particular quality of tiredness that comes not from exhaustion, but from the deep satisfaction of time well spent in pleasant company. It occurs to you that this might be the real Roman achievement, not the aqueducts or the roads or the architectural marvels, impressive as they are, but this ability to create conditions where human beings can relax sufficiently to actually enjoy each other's company. The systematic application of engineering and psychology to the simple goal of making people comfortable enough to be kind. You rather suspect your own civilization, for all its technological sophistication, has somehow made this basic objective considerably more complicated than it needs to be. The evening air carries the scent of cooling gardens and distant olive groves, mixing with the fading aromas of the feast to create something that smells like contentment itself. Through the strategically positioned windows, you can glimpse the villa's grounds settling into darkness, marble pathways glowing softly in moonlight that seems designed specifically for this moment of gentle conclusion. Your host catches your eye and raises his cup one final time, not for a toast exactly, but more like a quiet acknowledgement of the evening's success. Around the room, other guests respond with similar gestures, small movements that suggest both gratitude and the comfortable understanding that all good things must eventually wind toward their natural endings. The conversation continues, but softer now, with longer pauses that feel contemplative rather than awkward. The kind of peaceful quiet that develops when people have said what they needed to say and are content to simply exist together in the same warm, well-designed space. As the oil lamps burn lower and the villa's engineered comfort works its intended magic, you find yourself thinking about all the countless evenings like this one, stretching back through centuries of human beings gathered around tables, trying to make sense of existence through the simple act of sharing food and conversation and carefully controlled environments. The Romans perhaps simply got better at the engineering than most, but the fundamental impulse, this desire to create conditions where people can be comfortable together, seems to persist across all the centuries, in all the various forms that human civilization has taken. It's rather lovely when you think about it. All this effort, all this sophisticated planning and technological innovation, ultimately in service of helping people feel less alone in the universe, at least for an evening. The warmth of the hypocaust floors beneath your feet, the gentle flicker of lamp flames, the soft murmur of contented conversation. All of it combines into something that feels less like a dinner party than like a brief refuge from the fundamental strangeness of being conscious in an uncertain world. You settle back into the perfectly engineered comfort of your couch, letting the villa's systems and the evening's gentle rhythm carry you toward that pleasant drowsiness that makes the boundary between waking and sleeping feel wonderfully irrelevant. Outside, the Roman night continues its ancient patterns. Inside, surrounded by marble and wine, and the quiet satisfaction of human beings who have successfully created something beautiful together, you drift towards sleep with the comforting knowledge that some things, warmth, kindness, the simple pleasure of good company, remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. Even if the engineering has become rather less elegant in the meantime, the warmth begins to fade from your fingertips as you step away from the villa's perfect comfort, drawn by curiosity towards the sounds drifting from the streets beyond. Even at this hour, Rome never quite sleeps. The capital hums with a different energy than the engineered tranquility you've just left behind, something more immediate, more honestly human. Your sandals find the worn stones of the street, each step echoing softly against walls that have absorbed centuries of similar footfalls. The air here carries different scents: baking bread from pre-dawn ovens, the sharp tang of fermented fish sauce, the earthy smell of olive oil heating over small flames. This is where the real Rome lives, away from marble columns and hypocaust floors, where people wake before sunrise to knead dough and tend fires, where the day's first meal might be nothing more than bread dipped in wine, eaten while standing in doorways that face east towards whatever small mercies the morning might bring. You pass a thermopolium, one of those small street food counters that dot the city like ancient predecessors to coffee shops. Large ceramic jars embedded in stone counters hold the day's offerings: lentil stew, chickpea porridge, watered wine mixed with honey. The proprietor dozes against his wall, trusting that Rome's perpetual hunger will wake him when customers arrive. It's a different kind of dining than the elaborate choreography you've just witnessed. Here, people eat standing up quickly, focused more on fuel than ceremony. A handful of olives, bread spread with garum, that ubiquitous fish sauce that Romans put on everything the way you might use salt. The taste would probably challenge your modern palate, all that fermented anchovy essence. But hunger has its own seasoning. These streets have seen centuries of people finding genuine satisfaction in simple combinations of grain and salt and whatever the sea provides. You wonder about their stomachs, these everyday Romans. What did all that garum and rough bread and cheap wine do to digestive systems that had never encountered anything resembling modern medicine? The answer, as you might suspect, was both practical and surprisingly social. The wealthy had their private retiring rooms with marble surfaces and discreet arrangements, but for everyone else, Rome's approach to bodily necessities was refreshingly communal. Public latrines lined with stone benches, designed for multiple occupants who apparently saw no particular reason to suffer alone through life's more mundane requirements. Picture it, rows of Romans conducting their daily business whilst discussing politics, weather, the rising price of grain. A kind of democratic equality that your modern civilization, for all its supposed openness, has somehow managed to make far more private and considerably more awkward. The facilities themselves were marvels of engineering, with running water beneath the seats and sophisticated drainage systems that would impress contemporary city planners. But the real innovation was social. The understanding that certain biological realities might be more bearable when shared with neighbors who were dealing with identical challenges. You pause beside what was once such a facility, now just broken stones and weeds, trying to imagine the conversations that echoed here. Someone complaining about their landlord, someone else sharing gossip from the market, the comfortable chatter of people who had learnt to find community in the most unlikely circumstances. Of course, there was the matter of cleanup. Romans approached this with characteristic engineering enthusiasm, developing the tersorium, essentially a sponge attached to a stick, kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar, for what we might generously call sanitization purposes. The charming detail that modern historians rarely emphasize, these sponges were shared. Communal. You would use the same implement as the previous occupant, trusting in the cleaning power of salt water and the general Roman belief that most problems could be solved through systematic application of practical solutions. You might think twice about sitting down after a stranger, especially if they hadn't rinsed with particular thoroughness. Though perhaps, after generations of shared sponges, Romans developed either stronger constitutions or more philosophical attitudes towards the limits of hygiene. It's the sort of detail that makes you appreciate certain aspects of modern life with renewed gratitude. Some innovations, individual toilet paper, private bathrooms, the blessed anonymity of conducting personal business without an audience, probably qualify as genuine improvements to the human condition. The street curves ahead of you, following ancient contours of hills that were old when the empire was young. Other night wanderers move through the shadows, bakers heading to work, guards making their rounds, people whose reasons for being awake at this hour remain their own private mysteries. Their digestive systems, like yours, follow rhythms that connect them to every human who has ever walked these streets. The fundamental processes of nourishment and elimination that remain remarkably consistent across centuries, regardless of whether you're dining on peacock tongues or bread dipped in fish sauce. The Romans simply made these realities more visible, more communal, more honestly acknowledged as part of the shared experience of being human. They built their civilization around the frank acceptance that everyone eats, everyone digests, everyone requires certain facilities, and everyone might as well be comfortable whilst doing so. There's something almost refreshing about such directness. Your own culture tends to pretend that half of human existence simply doesn't happen, creating elaborate euphemisms and private anxieties around biological processes that the Romans discussed over shared sponges and running water. A cat appears from an alleyway, pausing to consider whether you pose any threat to its nocturnal hunting plans. Roman cats, you realize, probably faced similar digestive challenges as their human neighbors, though they solved them with considerably more independence and significantly better hygiene instincts. The animal disappears back into the shadows, leaving you alone with the quiet sounds of a city settling into its deepest sleep. Even Rome's famous energy eventually yields to the simple human need for rest, for the restoration that comes when consciousness finally stops trying so hard to make sense of everything. You find yourself thinking about all the stomachs that have processed meals on these streets, all the bodies that have navigated the daily requirements of existence, all the people who discovered that sharing even life's most mundane challenges could somehow transform them into something approaching community. The Romans perhaps understood something about human nature that your more private age has temporarily forgotten. that certain experiences become more bearable when acknowledged as universally shared rather than individually endured. Walking these ancient streets in the quiet hours before dawn, surrounded by stones that have witnessed centuries of very ordinary people dealing with very ordinary problems, you feel connected to something larger than any single evening's engineered comfort. The simple recognition that you, like every human who has ever lived, must eat and digest and find places to rest. That there's strange comfort in knowing that others before you have done exactly the same things, in exactly these places, with varying degrees of success and sophistication. Your footsteps echo softly against the worn stones, joining the endless percussion of human presence that has marked time in this city for longer than memory can contain. Each step a gentle reminder that the most profound connections across time are often the most ordinary ones. The shared rhythms of bodies that must be fed, rested, and cared for, no matter which century they happen to inhabit. Your footsteps echo softly against the worn stones, joining the endless percussion of human presence that has marked time in this city for longer than memory can contain. Each step a gentle reminder that the most profound connections across time are often the most ordinary ones. The shared rhythms of bodies that must be fed, rested, and cared for, no matter which century they happen to inhabit. The streets begin to curve back towards familiar territory, though you're not entirely certain when you decided to return. Perhaps it was the growing weight of the night air, or the way the shadows have started to feel less like mystery and more like invitation to rest. The villa's warm glow appears ahead, spilling golden light across the same stones you walked hours ago when the evening's feast was still unfolding in all its elaborate absurdity. You pause at the threshold, looking back towards the sleeping city that continues its ancient business of breathing, digesting, dreaming. Somewhere in those twisting streets, the remnants of 1,000 meals are making their way through Roman stomachs with the same patient persistence that has characterized human biology since people first discovered that certain combinations of grain and salt and thyme could produce something approaching satisfaction. The villa welcomes you back with its engineered warmth, the hypocaust system still murmuring beneath the floors like a contented cat. It occurs to you that this too is a kind of digestive system, the building slowly processing fuel into comfort, transforming wood and flame into the gentle heat that makes Roman winter nights bearable. You settle back into the soft cushions where this evening's journey began, when vomitoria were still mysterious architectural features rather than practical solutions to the fundamental problem of human excess. The peacock feathers catch the lamplight with their impossible colours, still beautiful, still slightly ridiculous, still perfectly Roman in their commitment to making even the most extravagant choices seem somehow inevitable. Outside, dawn remains hours away. The city sleeps its ancient sleep, full of people who will wake to face the same basic challenges that occupied their ancestors and will occupy their descendants. The need to eat, to rest, to find ways of making ordinary existence feel meaningful and occasionally magnificent. The Romans, you realize, possessed a particular genius for this transformation. They took the simple fact of human appetite and turned it into theatre. They took the mundane necessity of elimination and made it social. They built entire rooms dedicated to the radical proposition that sometimes comfort requires the temporary abandonment of everything you've just consumed. Perhaps that's the real lesson hidden in all those marble vomitoria and shared sponges and elaborate reclining positions. Not that the Romans were particularly different from anyone else, but that they understood something about human nature that bears remembering. We are all, fundamentally, creatures seeking relief from the beautiful burden of our own appetites. The lamp flame wavers slightly, casting shifting shadows across walls that have absorbed centuries of similar evenings, similar reflections, similar moments when someone sat quietly and tried to make sense of what it means to be human in a world full of other humans who are struggling with identical questions. You think about the dinner guests from earlier, now scattered to their own beds and their own dreams, their stomachs working through the evening's offerings with the same quiet determination that has sustained human life since the first Roman discovered that fermented fish sauce, could make almost anything taste better, or at least different. Tomorrow, they'll wake to a world where vomiting rooms exist for practical reasons, where shared bathrooms make social sense, where the gap between appetite and satisfaction can be bridged by nothing more complex than taking a brief break and returning to the table with renewed enthusiasm. It's a worldview that your own century might find either horrifying or enviable, depending on your relationship with moderation. The cushions seem softer now, the warmth more embracing, the night air more welcoming. Your own digestion continues its patient work, processing not just the evening's meal, but somehow the entire experience of walking through time, of discovering that the distance between ancient Rome and modern life might be smaller than the gap between one course and the next. There's something deeply comforting about knowing that the same moon that illuminates these streets tonight once watched over Roman dinner parties, Roman street food vendors, Roman public latrines where people gathered to discuss the day's concerns whilst attending to life's most basic requirements. The same human needs, the same human solutions, the same human capacity for finding dignity and even joy in the midst of our most ordinary struggles. The Romans simply had the honesty to build their architecture around these realities rather than pretending they didn't exist. Your eyelids grow heavy as the villa settles deeper into its nocturnal quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls, perhaps a descendant of birds that once watched Romans stumble from vomitoria to return to their waiting meals, that witnessed centuries of people discovering that the most profound human experiences often happen in the spaces between indulgence and restraint, between appetite and satisfaction, between the company of others and the privacy of rest. The lamp flame grows smaller, steadier, more golden. The warmth from the hippocaust seems to pulse gently through the floors, like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the slow rhythm of a city that has learned to sleep peacefully with the knowledge that tomorrow will bring new appetites, new solutions, new opportunities to transform the ordinary business of being human into something approaching art. You close your eyes and let the night settle around you like a familiar blanket, woven from threads that connect every person who has ever sought comfort, ever needed rest, ever discovered that sometimes the most sophisticated response to life's complexities is simply to lie down somewhere warm and let consciousness drift away from its endless questions. In the morning, the streets will fill again with people pursuing bread and conversation and all the small satisfactions that make existence bearable. But for now, there is only this: the gentle darkness, the patient warmth, the quiet knowledge that you have found your way to exactly the right place for rest. Sleep comes slowly, as it should, carrying you away on currents that have flowed through human experience since the first Roman closed their eyes after the first feast and dreamed of tomorrow's possibilities.